Hi and welcome. This is Phil Cheney. He is a fire scientist from Australia. Phil, what have you learned about fire fatalities over the years?
I guess, Mike, there's always a desperate tragedy about fire fatality, especially in rural areas and in urban areas, where the most common pattern is that people leave a safe location and drive and are overrun by the fire. Now, I'll just use a couple of examples. In 1983, it was a whole series of fires. I was working in Western Australia, and there were large fires on what was called Ash Wednesday through South Australia and Victorian. And in South Australia, I visited a number of fatality sites, and pretty much in each case, people had been in a safe area, which when you went back, they left a property that didn't burn, and they drove down and they were overrun by the fire. In most cases, they drove into the roadside vegetation in the smoke. They got disoriented, crashed the car. The car then burnt, and by and large in grasslands, it's the burning car which has killed them. The bushfire only put them in the position. I'll give you a photograph that you can display where if the person had stayed on the road as another person did, she would have, and her family would have survived. And I worry about this because people are not being told, I believe, how to make their home a safe haven for themselves. People get told to leave. Where are they going to go? This happens all over the world. It happens in California. It happens in Australia. You've got to get out. It's time to evacuate. And the next minute they say, it's too late to leave. Where the hell are they going to go? Mm-hmm. If that's not a mixed message, what is? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they say, oh, well, it's their fault. We told them to get out and they didn't leave in time. People are not going to do that. People always believe that, okay, I reckon there's a good chance the fire's going to miss me. So, make plans of where you're going to go. Well, bloody hell, I don't know where to go. Where am I going to go? If I leave this place, I don't know where the fire is, there's smoke everywhere. I've got a choice. I either drive into the centre of the town or I drive to a beach, or where's a safe place? I don't know. My first fatality fire was at Lara in Melbourne, where a fire swept across a highway. People stopped their cars as the fire hit them, got out and tried to walk back to a safe spot, outside the fire. People who stayed in their car survived. It's on a highway, the road didn't burn. One person who laid flat down on the ground on the highway survived. He was pretty badly burnt, but he survived. Now, if you're going to survive a fire, the absolute necessity is you must find a place that won't burn. And if you're in a car or you're driving through forest or woodland, yeah, it's a good idea not to hang around if there's fires in the area. And if you think you're going to be overrun, you just have to find the biggest bare area that you can possibly find. Now, most people will be in a car, and so there was a myth that petrol tanks exploded, and we tried to burn cars, we tried to explode petrol tanks, we couldn't do it. The idea of petrol tank exploding comes from the movies where cars were driven off cliffs and exploded at some point halfway down, or when they hit the ground the whole thing went up in a mighty explosion. It doesn't happen in a fire. In modern cars, if the fuel line is rubber and is exposed underneath, yes, that can burn out and that can spill petrol underneath you, and that will create a flame all around the car, which is not exploding, but it's almost as bad. The petrol tank burns. In older cars, we could get a burnt out car and the fuel tank was still burning at the filler pipe, because the concentration of petrol to oxygen in a fuel tank, which is hot, is too high to explode, and it burns as a vapour outside, a diffusion flame outside the tank. We come back. Your home, if you're living in the country, is your safest venue. If you decide that when a fire goes you're going to stay at home, then make sure you've made it as as less flammable as you possibly can. This means being able to have an irrigated lawn. If you can't have an irrigated lawn, then basically you have to go to an arid zone type garden, cactus and pebbles and things. It's not everybody's liking, but remove eucalypts, remove pine trees, remove hedges, remove all those things that have masses of flammable material inside them, which are hidden by a green veneer on the outside. Cypress hedges are a classic example. If you do that, even if your house eventually catches fire and burns down, the house is going to burn down from the inside, or it will burn down because there's been some fracture of a window for some reason. If you cleared the vegetation from around you, the latter is unlikely to happen. But you can always get embers driving into the house which may catch it alight and burn it down. Mm-hmm. By the time the house burns down, the country outside the fire has gone and has burnt out. If you rush out when the fire is approaching, you will be caught and you'll be overrun. And as they were in 2009 in Victoria, 100 people fled the fires and they died in and out of their cars. They crashed them, the cars burnt, and most of the time it's the burning car that kills the people. The car was set alight by the bushfire. But if you can find an area on a bare ground, get there. If you're on a road in the country, staying on the road is hazardous because of other traffic who may be ploughing through the smoke where you're unsure of. You are much safer finding a gate into a grassy paddock and driving out and sitting in that. Because although the grass fire may burn around you, the grass fire in a grazed paddock is only going to last flames 5 to 10 seconds, burnout time maybe a minute. Your car may catch alight, but it won't burn that fast. So it'll be miserable, but you can get out and you'll be safe on burnt ground. In the bush, for firefighters, we've had relatively few fatalities of individual firefighters who are doing direct firefighting. It's considered now to be a particularly hazardous occupation, but back in the 80s when I did a survey in Victoria, the major fire injury to firefighters in the bush in Victoria was burn injuries because they were walking on burnt ground and put their hole into a burning stump. The actions of other people have mostly been associated with tankers in the bush. When I discovered that if a fire is burning from a broad front, it immediately moves at its potential rate of spread. Now, when people are fighting fires, if they're working along the edge of a narrow fire, that fire can be spreading relatively slowly. It can be a surface fire, and it may be spreading at only a third of the potential rate of spread of the fire spreading from a broad front. So there has certainly been fatalities where tankers have been in a position where they were caught in a wind change, and part of the problem of perception is the fire on the flanks has been low, spreading slowly. The fire doesn't look like much, flames less than a metre, maybe, even less. One of these sudden wind changes comes through, and that fire then, under a high wind speed, then spreads as a broad front. It's travelling at its potential rate of spread straight away. Initially the flames are close to the ground because the wind's just come out over the burnt ground and has flattened the fire out. But as it covers more and more fuel, it'll stand up, and by the time it's gone 100 metres, it's up into the crowns, sometimes a bit quicker. So, in terms of putting yourself in that situation, the most common and the most sensible safe space is on the burnt ground that has been burnt out for some time, further back. So I created this video called the Dead Man Zone, and the Dead Man Zone is any place around the fire where you cannot access the burnt ground in less than a minute, or a minute. So, the firefighters have to be watching the change. If there's a potential change, they must retire immediately back onto the burnt ground. Now, in our forests, the total fuel load of a relatively innocuous looking forest, which has been long unburnt, can be as high as 100 tonnes per hectare. This includes the dead material up to the large logs, the bark, everything. In drought conditions, more than 50% of that fuel will burn. Perhaps the largest logs will remain unburnt, but 50%. And you have to allow some time to elapse before you can stand uninjured on burnt ground, recently burnt ground. Now, in a grassland, which is an annual pasture, which has no residual material on the ground, you can step onto burnt ground 2 metres behind the flame front, and it's not only cool on the ground because everything's burnt out, but you're also in the downdraft of the air blowing into the front of the fire, so you've got fresh air to breathe. You move further back, then you've got all the smoke blowing along horizontally. If the grass is older or has got material in it, it may be as long as 5 minutes before you can survive on that area without suffering some sort of burn and enough heat to affect you. So in a forest fire, in that first case that I mentioned of 50 tonnes of fuel burning, you can't get onto that area and survive for at least 3/4 of an hour, sometimes an hour. Now, if you're working along a flank fire, which is spreading very slowly, sideways, you can go back to where you can enter and you can walk across that period of burning in maybe half a dozen quick strides. So you can get across that smouldering area. If it's close to the front of the fire, then you can't survive on that burnt area. So the idea that you can, in a forest, light a fire and then step immediately onto the burnt area is fraught with danger, because if there's any large material, it'll still be burning. I think, what else is to say?
Let me see.
What's it?
Okay.
No, I think I've covered that. There's
Tell me.
something else is running through my mind which I haven't seen.
Let's see, we've done, what have you learned from fatality fires, dead man's area, how to survive entrapments, advice?
The one thing I didn't mention, which is not given any credence at all, is the impact of convective heat on people. Now, you as a firefighter who's working hard, you've raised your body temperature, deep body temperature is raised to about 39 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees above the normal temperature. And it stabilises that because the evaporation of water from your skin keeps your skin colder than 39 degrees, and you evaporate water and you dissipate that heat so that your internal deep body temperature remains about the same. If you are caught in the downdraft of the convection of a fire for any reason, the convection of this the temperature will be anywhere between, let's say, 60 and 100 degrees Celsius. Doesn't seem all that hot, but it immediately raises your skin temperature to something greater than 39. And that can lead to almost instantaneous collapse and heat stroke. We had a firefighter on a small fire measuring just what intensity firefighters could control with hand tools in eucalypt bush. We got one guy who was we'd gone round the front of the fire. He got caught in a sudden downdraft which just blew hot convective gases down around him, and he collapsed almost instantaneously. We had him wired up with all the instruments to measure deep body temperature and skin temperature, and we noted that his skin temperature had immediately risen above his deep body temperature. We took him out, fortunately, got him in a cool spot, revived him, gave him a spray of water, cooled him down quickly, and he was okay. But, so the other thing, there's a lot of talk about protecting yourself from radiant heat. Lots of people say that. Radiant heat is the killer. Radiant heat is easily blocked, and I think we'll lead on to that with the fire tent story. But convective heat is not so easily blocked. Now remember, the convective heat is carried up in that fire structure that I showed, but it's turbulent, so it can turn over and come down to the ground level again. Behind the fire, when the fire front passes over a certain point, the wind that is blowing down and is blowing into the back of the fire is high speed. It picks up masses of burning, charring material, and it's of a temperature somewhere in the order of maybe only 30 or 40 degrees. Flame temperatures, by and large, are not all that high, but it doesn't have to be all that high to give you a heat stroke if you're in convective gases. So, if you're in the bush, there's a couple of things you have to look at. You have to look at protecting yourself from radiant heat, and there we can talk about the fire tent a bit later. But you also have to find a position where you give yourself some shelter from convected heat. And that's, you must sort of understand where you are on a slope in relation to the fire. And if you're upslope of a fire that has the potential to burn up towards you, you have to get yourself out of there and around and down the slope to get towards the back of the fire. Because even on bare ground, on an upslope, the convective gases are running close to the ground, and they have killed at least 3 or 4 forestry workers, to my knowledge. The explanation was unexplained. They were found dead, unburnt, on burnt area, but there was a little bit of heat damage in their lungs. Not much, a bit of smoke damage. I can only surmise, because of this example of this guy, that they were caught somehow in a downdraft and died of heat stroke. Very sudden, on the spot. I hope people understand the importance of what fuel is and getting away from what creates heat in a bushfire. As much space as possible.
Phil, thanks for chatting with us about that today. That's a really interesting subject, and we really appreciate it. We're doing this for all of you. If you like what we're doing, please give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment below. See you next time.